The deeper Kale and Lyra ventured into the alien ruins, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew heavier, charged with static electricity that made their hair stand on end. Strange symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with the hum emanating from the crystalline structures around them. It was as if the ruins themselves were alive, watching their every move. "This place feels wrong," Lyra murmured, her voice barely audible over the constant hum. She adjusted the strap of the energy device slung over her shoulder, its faint blue glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Like we're intruding." Kale nodded, his grip tightening on the jagged metal weapon he'd fashioned earlier. "We don't have a choice. If this is where the answers are, then we push forward." Eos floated ahead, scanning the environment with its sensors. "Energy readings indicate we are approaching the central chamber. Proceed with caution. Unknown variables may pose additional risks." As they rounded a corner, the narrow passageway opened into a vast cavernous space. At its center hovered a colossal sphere suspended midair, glowing with an intense blue light that illuminated the entire chamber. The sphere pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, and waves of energy radiated outward, making the air shimmer like heat haze. Surrounding it were intricate carvings and glyphs covering every surface, forming patterns too complex for Kale or Lyra to decipher at first glance. "That's it," Lyra whispered, awe evident in her voice. "That must be the quantum core. This is what powers everything. The crystals, the guardians, maybe even the cryopods." Kale stepped closer, his boots crunching against the metallic floor. "How do we use it? Can you interface with it?" Lyra hesitated, studying the sphere intently. "It's not just a power source, it's some kind of processor. Whoever built this designed it to solve problems, calculate solutions, maybe even store knowledge. But accessing it isn't going to be easy." Eos analyzed the sphere, projecting holographic data streams onto the ground. Preliminary scans suggest the core operates on a puzzle-based activation system. Solving the sequence will unlock its full potential. "A puzzle?" Kale frowned, looking at the glowing glyphs around them. "You mean we have to figure out how to turn it on ourselves?" "Essentially," Lyra replied, already crouching near one of the walls. She traced her fingers over the symbols, muttering under her breath as she tried to make sense of their arrangement. "These glyphs represent concepts: time, energy, life, death. They're interconnected, forming a narrative of sorts. We need to align them correctly to activate the core." Time ticked away as they worked together, piecing clues together like fragments of a shattered mirror. Kale focused on physical tasks, manipulating panels and mechanisms embedded in the walls, while Lyra deciphered the meaning behind the symbols. Eos provided real-time analysis, offering suggestions based on its calculations. But the deeper they delved, the more unstable the chamber became. The sphere's pulses grew erratic, sending shockwaves through the room that knocked them off balance. Cracks began forming in the walls, and dust rained down from above. "We're running out of time," Lyra shouted, her hands trembling as she adjusted the final glyph. "If we don't finish soon, the whole structure could collapse." Kale steadied her, his voice firm despite the chaos. "We're close, just a little more." With a final adjustment, the glyphs aligned perfectly, and the sphere let out a deafening roar. A surge of energy erupted from the core, bathing the chamber in blinding light. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The hum stopped, the vibrations ceased, and silence fell. Then the ground shook violently, and parts of the ceiling collapsed, forcing them to flee. As they sprinted back through the passageways, the ruins crumbled behind them, swallowing the secrets they had uncovered forever. When they emerged into the open desert, gasping for air, Kale looked back at the ruins now buried beneath tons of sand. "Did we do it?" he asked, turning to Lyra. She nodded, clutching the energy device tightly. The core activated. The pod should start waking everyone up soon. But as they caught their breath, Cal couldn't shake the feeling that the true cost of their actions was yet to be revealed. The alien ships descended like giants from the sky, their sleek metallic hulls reflecting the twin suns with an almost blinding brilliance. Cal and his team raced back to the settlement as fast as they could, but the enormity of what awaited them weighed heavily on everyone's minds. The drones had been scouts, sentinels sent to test humanity's resolve. Now, the real power behind them was here. When they arrived at the crash site, chaos reigned. Survivors scrambled to gather supplies, fortify makeshift shelters, and prepare whatever defenses they could cobble together. Morale was low, fear palpable. Many questioned whether resistance was even worth it. If these aliens wanted them gone, how could mere humans possibly stand against such overwhelming force? Cal called for calm, standing atop a dune overlooking the encampment. His voice carried across the crowd, firm and resolute. We've survived 50,000 years in stasis, fought off guardians of this planet, and awakened 10,000 souls who believed all hope was lost. This isn't the end. It's just another challenge, and we'll face it head-on. His words stirred something in the survivors. Slowly, people began organizing themselves, pooling resources, and constructing barricades using salvaged wreckage. Engineers worked tirelessly to repurpose alien tech scavenged from the ruins, creating rudimentary weapons capable of defending against the invaders. Lyra coordinated efforts to set up energy barriers powered by fragments of the glowing liquid, buying time for those less combat-ready to retreat deeper into the camp. As night fell, the alien fleet loomed ominously overhead, casting long shadows over the desert. Lights flickered across the hulls of the ships, signaling activity within. Then, without warning, beams of energy lanced down from the sky, striking the outer edges of the settlement. Sand erupted into geysers, tents were incinerated, and panic threatened to break loose. "Hold your ground," Cal shouted, leading a small group toward the source of the attack. Using modified tools rigged with alien crystals, they managed to disrupt one of the energy beams, forcing the attackers to recalibrate. It was a minor victory, but enough to rally the defenders. In the heat of battle, Cal made a daring decision. Armed with nothing but courage, and carrying the shard of crystal that had first spoken to him, he approached the largest ship alone, hands raised in surrender. A hatch opened, and he stepped inside, surrounded by towering figures cloaked in shimmering armor. Their faces were obscured, but their presence radiated authority. "I'm not your enemy," Cal said firmly, meeting the gaze of the lead figure. Through nonverbal communication facilitated by the crystal shard, flashes of memories passed between them, images of Earth, humanity's struggles, and their shared desire for survival. For the first time, understanding sparked in the alien commander's eyes. After tense negotiations, a fragile truce was brokered. The aliens revealed they were descendants of refugees who fled this world millennia ago, driven by war and fear. They saw humanity as intruders, but also as echoes of their own past. In exchange for sharing knowledge and resources, they agreed to coexist peacefully, helping humanity rebuild while reclaiming their ancestral homeland. As dawn broke over the crimson sands, Cal stood beside the alien commander, looking out over the battered yet resilient settlement. Humanity had faced extinction and emerged stronger. Together, humans and aliens vowed to forge a new future, united by the lessons of history and the promise of hope. For the first time in 50,000 years, Cal allowed himself a smile. The journey ahead would be long, but humanity wasn't alone anymore. The crimson suns hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the endless desert. Sand whipped through the air like a restless spirit, stinging exposed skin and obscuring vision. Beneath the surface of this alien wasteland, something stirred. A faint hum echoed through the darkness as frost-covered glass began to crackle and fog. Inside the cryogenic pod, a man lay motionless, his body preserved in suspended animation for tens of thousands of years. Cal's eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh light filtering through the cracked lid of the pod. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, unfamiliar with the thin atmosphere around him. For a moment, he was disoriented. Where was he? What had happened? Fragments of memory flickered in his mind. Earth, a starship, the promise of a new beginning. Then nothing but silence. With effort, Cale pushed against the lid of the pod, shattering it into shards that scattered across the sandy floor. He stumbled out, his legs weak from centuries of inactivity. The heat hit him like a wall, searing his skin and making sweat bead on his forehead almost instantly. Looking around, he saw only barren dunes stretching endlessly in every direction. There were no signs of life, no buildings, no ships, just an unforgiving expanse of red sand under twin blazing suns. "Welcome back, Commander," a voice said suddenly, startling him. It was calm, mechanical, and tinged with static. Cale turned sharply toward the source, a small floating drone hovering nearby. Its metallic frame gleamed despite being covered in dust, and its single optical sensor blinked rhythmically. "Who? What are you?" Cale asked hoarsely, clutching his side as if trying to steady himself. "I am EO's auxiliary AI unit of the Starfarer Initiative," the drone replied. "You have been in cryostasis for approximately 50,000 years." Cale froze, his heart pounding. 50,000 years. That couldn't be right. The mission was supposed to take less than a decade. Before he could question further, EOS continued. "Your vessel suffered critical damage during transit. We crash-landed here after detecting sabotage on board. I regret to inform you that communication with Earth is impossible at this time." Cale's stomach dropped. Sabotage? How? By whom? And where were the others? As if reading his thoughts, EOS tilted slightly and projected a holographic map onto the sand. Thousands of dots blinked across the landscape, each representing another cryopod buried beneath the dunes. "There are 10,000 individuals in stasis," EOS explained. "However, my systems indicate anomalies preventing their reactivation. Without intervention, they will remain dormant indefinitely, or worse, perish." Cale stared at the map, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. 10,000 lives depended on him now, but how could he possibly save them all when he didn't even know where to start? As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and the twin moons rose high above the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the desert. Cale wrapped himself in tattered thermal blankets salvaged from the wreckage of his pod. Despite the biting cold, sleep eluded him. Every sound, the whisper of the wind, the shifting sands, felt ominous, as though the planet itself was alive and watching. Then came the realization. They weren't alone here. In the distance, strange crystalline structures jutted out of the ground, glowing faintly in the moonlight. They hadn't been there earlier, or had they? Something about them felt unnatural, almost sentient. Cale knew survival wouldn't come easy. This place was hostile, alien, and full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Yet deep down, a spark of determination ignited within him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them, for the sake of the 10,000 souls counting on him to bring them back to life. And so, with trembling hands and resolute resolve, Cale took his first steps into the unknown, ready to fight for humanity's future among the stars. The desert stretched endlessly before them, an ocean of crimson sand under twin blazing suns. Cale led the scouting team cautiously, his boots sinking slightly with each step. Behind him, Lyra adjusted the straps of her pack, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The rest of the group followed in silence, their faces etched with determination and fear. They had left the relative safety of the crash site behind, venturing into uncharted territory, where every shadow could hide danger. For days, they trudged through the barren landscape, finding little more than rocks and brittle shrubs that crumbled at a touch. Supplies dwindled quickly, and tempers flared as exhaustion set in. But just when hope began to fade, something unexpected appeared on the horizon. a cluster of towering spires jutting out of the sands like jagged teeth. Unlike the ruins they had destroyed earlier, these structures seemed intact, their metallic surfaces gleaming faintly despite centuries of exposure to the elements. Could this be another settlement? One of the scouts asked, shielding his eyes from the glare of the suns. Lyra shook her head, squinting at the distant shapes. It's too uniform to be natural. But I don't think it's alien either. Look closer. Kale raised a hand to signal the group to stop. Through Eo's enhanced sensors, he studied the structures carefully. It's human, he said finally, his voice tinged with disbelief. Or at least, it was built by humans. The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the team. How could there be human-made structures here? Had someone else survived the crash, or had humanity reached this world long before they did? As they approached, the truth became clearer. The spires were remnants of an ancient colony, its buildings half buried in sand, but still recognizable. Faded insignias marked the walls, symbols of Earth's old space programs. This wasn't a new discovery, it was evidence of failure. Whoever had come here hadn't lasted long. Broken machinery lay scattered across the ground, and skeletal remains rested in the shadows of collapsed roofs. "This place is cursed," muttered one of the scouts, clutching his weapon tightly. "We should turn back." "No," Kale said firmly, stepping forward. "If we leave now, we'll never know what happened here, and whether their mistakes can teach us how to survive." Inside one of the larger buildings, they found records, cracked data tablets, and dusty journals detailing the struggles of the colonists. Disease, resource shortages, internal conflict, it all sounded painfully familiar. Yet among the despair, there were glimmers of hope. Maps marked potential water sources, notes described edible plants native to the planet, and schematics outlined ways to adapt Earth technology to local conditions. "This changes everything," Lyra whispered, flipping through a journal filled with sketches of alien flora. "They didn't fail because they couldn't adapt. They failed because they gave up." Kale nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. These forgotten pioneers had paved the way, even if they hadn't realized it. Now it was their turn to finish what those settlers had started. But as they prepared to leave, Eos detected movement outside, a swarm of glowing dots approaching rapidly. At first, they thought it was another wave of worm-like guardians, but as the figures drew closer, they realized the truth. Drones, sleek and mechanical, descending from the sky. "They're not from Earth," Lyra breathed, gripping her energy device tighter. A metallic voice boomed overhead, speaking in an unfamiliar language. Then, abruptly, it switched to broken English. "You trespass. Leave, or perish." Kale stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not enemies. We're survivors." The drones hovered silently, their weapons trained on the group. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without warning, the lead drone transmitted a single message directly into Cal's mind. "Prove your worth." The challenge hung heavy in the air. Whatever these machines were, they weren't about to let humanity reclaim this world easily. Cal exchanged a glance with Lyra, knowing they had only one choice: fight or die trying. And so, with gritted teeth and fire in their hearts, they braced themselves for what came next. Humanity's future depended on proving they belonged, not just to this planet, but to the stars beyond. The whispers followed Cal everywhere he went, growing louder with each passing hour. At first, they were faint murmurs carried by the wind, but soon they became distinct voices, fragmented sentences spoken in languages he didn't recognize. Yet somehow, their meaning pierced through the chaos, as if his mind instinctively translated them. The sound was maddening, haunting, and impossible to ignore. "Kale." The voice called again, clearer this time. It wasn't just a random noise. It knew him. He stopped walking, clutching his head as the voices swirled around him like a storm. His heart raced, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the freezing desert night. "What do you want?" He muttered under his breath, half expecting no answer. But the response came immediately. not in words, but in flashes of images that flooded his mind. A city unlike anything he'd ever seen appeared before him. Towering spires made of shimmering metal, streets alive with glowing lights, skies filled with sleek ships darting between floating platforms. Then, suddenly, destruction. Fire rained from the heavens, buildings crumbled into dust, and screams echoed in the distance. Shadows moved across the ruins, monstrous shapes blotting out the suns. Panic gripped Cal's chest as he watched families fleeing, carrying whatever belongings they could salvage. They boarded ships, desperate to escape, to leave behind their dying world. Eos hovered nearby, its optical sensor blinking rapidly. "Commander, your vital signs indicate elevated stress levels. Are you experiencing hallucinations?" "It's not a hallucination," Cal snapped, shaking his head to clear the visions. "Something's showing me. Memories. Not mine, though. Someone else's." The drone tilted slightly, analyzing the situation. "It is possible the crystalline structures are interfacing directly with your neural pathways. Such technology would allow for data transfer via electromagnetic resonance." Cale frowned. "You mean these crystals are feeding me information? Why me?" "That remains unclear," Eos replied. "But the phenomenon appears linked to the shard you retrieved earlier. Its energy signature matches the frequency of the larger formations." Cale glanced at the crystal fragment tucked safely in his pocket. He hadn't thought much about it since picking it up, but now it felt heavier, almost alive. The whispers grew louder whenever he touched it, urging him to follow their guidance. Against his better judgment, he decided to trust them. For now. The voices led him deeper into the desert, away from the scattered pods, and toward an ominous crater glowing faintly in the distance. As he approached, the air grew thick with static electricity, raising the hairs on his arms. Inside the crater lay a pool of luminous blue liquid, its surface rippling gently despite the absence of wind. The whispers crescendoed here, surrounding him like a chorus. "Step closer," one voice urged, softer and more melodic than the others. It sounded feminine, comforting even. Cale hesitated, glancing back at Eos. "This doesn't feel safe." "Caution is advised," the drone said. "Prolonged exposure to unknown energy fields may result in irreversible cognitive damage." But curiosity overpowered fear. Slowly, Cale knelt beside the pool and dipped his fingers into the glowing liquid. Instantly, the visions returned, this time overwhelming him completely. He saw the aliens who once inhabited this world, tall and slender with skin like polished obsidian. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were graceful, almost otherworldly. He witnessed their rise as a civilization, their mastery of science and art, and their eventual downfall. A cataclysmic war waged against an enemy too powerful to defeat. Then, amidst the chaos, he saw hope. A group of survivors gathered near the very crater where he stood, placing objects into the glowing liquid. These weren't weapons or tools. They were records, fragments of their culture and knowledge meant to endure beyond their extinction. One figure stood out among them, a woman whose face bore an uncanny resemblance to Lyra Voss, the xenobiologist aboard the Starfarer. She placed her hand into the liquid, whispering words Cal couldn't understand. But somehow, he felt their meaning deep within his soul. When the vision faded, Cal staggered backward, gasping for air. His head throbbed, and his body trembled, but clarity struck him like lightning. The aliens had left something behind. A message, a legacy, maybe even a way to save humanity. "What did you see?" Eos asked cautiously. Cale looked at the drone, determination burning in his eyes. "I think I know how to wake the others." Cale returned to the crash site with a renewed sense of purpose, his mind racing with possibilities. The glowing liquid in the crater had shown him glimpses of hope, a way forward. But he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone who understood biology and alien tech enough to make sense of what he'd seen. That's when he remembered Dr. Lyra Voss. Lyra was one of the few survivors already awake, though barely. She had awakened prematurely due to a malfunctioning cryopod and had been wandering aimlessly near the wreckage until Kale found her collapsed under the harsh suns. Her skin was blistered, her lips cracked, but her sharp green eyes still held a spark of determination. When Kale explained what he'd discovered, the visions, the glowing liquid, the aliens' desperate attempt to preserve their legacy, Lyra listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to awe. "This could be groundbreaking," she murmured, running a hand through her matted hair. "If these ruins are remnants of an advanced civilization, they might hold the key to reviving our people." Together, they began gathering samples from the crystalline structures and the glowing pool. Lyra worked tirelessly, using makeshift tools scavenged from the wreckage to analyze the materials. Io is assisted by projecting holographic data onto the sand, mapping out energy signatures and chemical compositions. As night fell, the trio huddled around a dimly lit workspace carved into the side of a dune, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of alien artifacts. "These crystals emit a unique form of quantum energy," Lyra explained, holding up a shard that pulsed faintly in her hand. "It interacts with organic matter at a cellular level, potentially capable of repairing damage or even reactivating dormant systems." Kale leaned closer, his brow furrowed. "You're saying we can use this energy to wake the others?" "It's risky," Lyra admitted, her tone cautious. "The same energy that heals could also destabilize the cryopods if mishandled. We'd need to create a controlled interface, a bridge between the alien tech and our own systems." Eos chimed in, its voice steady. "I calculate a 63.7% probability of success, assuming optimal conditions are maintained throughout the process." "That's not exactly reassuring," Kale muttered, rubbing his temples. "But it's better than doing nothing." Over the next few days, Lyra devised a plan. Using fragments of the crystals and parts salvaged from the ruined ship, she constructed a crude device designed to amplify the energy emitted by the glowing liquid. The goal was simple yet daunting: channel the energy directly into the cryopods without overloading them. If successful, it would reactivate the stasis systems and bring the others back to life. If not, well, neither Lyra nor Kale wanted to think about that possibility. As they prepared for the first test, tensions ran high. Kale watched silently as Lyra calibrated the device, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward confidence. They chose a damaged pod on the outskirts of the site, one far enough from the main cluster to minimize risk. Inside lay a young man, his face frozen in peaceful repose. "Ready?" Lyra asked, glancing at Kale. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Do it." Lyra activated the device. A low hum filled the air as tendrils of blue energy snaked out from the machine, connecting to the pod. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the pod's display flickered to life, numbers scrolling rapidly across the screen. The glass fogged up, and the occupant stirred, gasping for air as the lid popped open. The young man blinked against the sunlight, confusion etched on his face. "Where am I?" Kale exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. It worked. Against all odds, it actually worked. But before anyone could celebrate, the ground beneath them trembled violently. A deep rumble echoed across the desert, followed by a deafening screech. From the sands emerged massive worm-like creatures, their bodies covered in armored plates and lined with rows of jagged teeth. They were drawn to the energy emanating from the device, and they weren't happy about it. "We've got company," Kale shouted, grabbing a piece of jagged metal to defend himself. Lyra quickly deactivated the device, but the creatures didn't retreat. Instead, they surged forward, attacking with relentless fury. "They're bioengineered constructs," Lyra yelled, dodging a swipe from one of the beasts. "Guardians programmed to protect the ruins." Kale swung his makeshift weapon, striking one of the creatures square in the head. Then let's hope they weren't protecting anything too important. As the battle raged, Kale realized one thing: waking humanity wouldn't be easy, not while something else wanted them to stay asleep forever. The morning suns rose higher, their light intensifying as Cal trudged across the desert. The crimson sands shimmered like molten glass, making it hard to focus. His boots sank with every step, and each movement felt heavier than the last. Despite the exhaustion, he pressed forward, driven by a mixture of curiosity and desperation. He needed answers, and fast. Eos hovered nearby, its metallic frame reflecting the harsh sunlight. "Commander, I suggest we prioritize locating viable resources," the drone chimed in, its voice calm but insistent. "Water reserves are critical if we intend to sustain prolonged activity." Cale nodded absently, his eyes scanning the horizon. Resources were important, yes, but something else gnawed at him. A nagging feeling that they weren't truly alone here. The crystalline structures he'd spotted the previous night loomed larger now, jutting out of the ground like jagged teeth. They pulsed faintly, emitting a soft hum that resonated through the air. It wasn't just random noise. There was rhythm to it, almost like communication. As Cale approached one of the structures, he reached out cautiously, brushing his fingers against its surface. The material was cool to the touch, smoother than anything he'd ever felt before. Instantly, a sharp jolt coursed through his arm, causing him to yank his hand back with a startled gasp. Tiny sparks danced along his fingertips, crackling softly before fading away. "Interesting," Eos remarked, analyzing the structure with its sensors. "These formations appear to be composed of an unknown energy-conductive material. Their composition suggests advanced engineering far beyond human capability." Cale frowned, rubbing his tingling hand. "You think whoever built this place is still around?" Eos hesitated, its optical sensor blinking rapidly. "Unknown. However, preliminary scans indicate significant decay in these structures. Based on estimated timelines, they may predate even your stasis period." That thought sent a chill down Cal's spine. If the ruins were older than 50,000 years, then who, or what, had created them? And why had they abandoned such a massive construction? His musings were interrupted when his foot struck something solid beneath the sand. Kneeling down, Cale began digging, uncovering what looked like bones, but not human ones. They were too large, too angular, with intricate patterns etched into their surface. As he brushed away more sand, fragments of armor or exoskeleton became visible. This wasn't some primitive creature. It belonged to an intelligent species. Cynological remains, Eos confirmed after scanning the skeleton. Carbon dating places these remains at approximately 70,000 years old. Cause of death appears consistent with violent trauma. Cale stood slowly, staring at the alien remains. Whoever these beings were, they hadn't died peacefully. Had they been attacked? Or had they destroyed themselves? Either way, the implications weighed heavily on him. If this planet had claimed one civilization already, what chance did humanity have? Nightfall came quickly, plunging the desert into shadow. Twin moons bathed the landscape in silver light, casting long, distorted shapes across the dunes. Cale huddled near a cluster of the glowing crystals, using their faint warmth to ward off the biting cold. But sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. Shadows shifted unnaturally, as though alive. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, carried by the breeze. At first, Cale thought it was his imagination. But the sound grew louder, clearer. Words, or fragments of them, echoed in his ears, spoken in languages he couldn't understand. Yet somehow they felt familiar, as though buried deep within his subconscious. "Do you hear that?" Cale whispered, glancing at Eos. The drone paused, its sensors whirring. "I detect no auditory anomalies, Commander. Are you experiencing auditory hallucinations?" Cale shook his head. No, this was real. The whispers seemed to originate from the crystals themselves, calling to him. Against his better judgment, he leaned closer, straining to make sense of the voices. One word stood out among the chaos. a name. Kale. His blood ran cold. How could these ancient ruins know his name? With trembling hands, Kale grabbed a shard of crystal from the ground, tucking it into his pocket. Whatever secrets this world held, he intended to uncover them. For the sake of the 10,000 still sleeping, he couldn't afford to turn back now. The desert erupted into chaos as the massive worm-like creatures surged forward, their armored bodies carving trenches through the sand. Kale swung his jagged metal weapon with every ounce of strength, but each blow barely scratched their thick hides. The creatures moved with terrifying speed, their gaping maws lined with razor-sharp teeth, snapping at anything within reach. Lyra scrambled backward, clutching the energy device tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to get out of here," she shouted, ducking as one of the beasts lunged toward her. "No," Kale barked, blocking another attack with his makeshift blade. "If we leave the device, they'll destroy it, and we'll lose our only chance to save the others." Eos hovered nearby, its sensors scanning the battlefield. Analysis suggests these constructs are drawn to the energy emitted by the device. Deactivating it may reduce their aggression. Kale gritted his teeth, dodging a swipe from one of the worms. Deactivating it won't stop them now. They're already attacking. We have to fight back. Lyra hesitated for a moment before nodding. She fumbled with the device in her hands, adjusting settings while trying to stay out of harm's way. "I can try to overload the energy output," she called out. "It might drive them away, or fry us all." "Do it," Kale yelled, slamming his weapon into the side of a creature that had cornered him. Sparks flew as the blade scraped against its metallic plating, but the beast barely flinched. With trembling fingers, Lyra activated the device's emergency protocols, pushing the energy output far beyond safe limits. A blinding blue pulse radiated outward, engulfing the area in an intense wave of light and heat. The worms recoiled instantly, their armored bodies convulsing as if struck by some invisible force. For a brief moment, the air crackled with static electricity, and the ground itself seemed to shudder beneath their feet. Then, silence. The creatures retreated into the sands, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. Smoke rose from scorched patches where their bodies had touched the ground, leaving behind deep gouges and shattered crystal shards. Kale dropped to his knees, breathing heavily as adrenaline coursed through his veins. His arms ached, and blood trickled down his temple from a shallow gash caused by flying debris. That was insane. Lyra panted, lowering the still glowing device. Her face was pale, streaked with sweat and dirt. "We got lucky. If those things had stuck around any longer." "They didn't," Kale interrupted, forcing himself to stand. He wiped the blood from his forehead with the back of his hand, looking around at the devastation. "But this proves something important. These guardians aren't just animals. They're machines, designed to protect whatever secrets lie buried here." Eos chimed in, its voice tinged with urgency. "Scans indicate residual energy signatures emanating from deeper layers of the ruins. It is likely the core systems controlling these constructs are located below ground." Kale frowned, staring at the glowing crater in the distance. The same crater that had shown him visions of the alien civilization's final days. "So the closer we get to answers, the more dangerous it becomes," he muttered under his breath. "Great." Lyra stepped beside him, her expression resolute despite the exhaustion etched on her face. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we don't have a choice, not if we want to save everyone still frozen in those pods. Whatever lies beneath the surface, we'll face it together." Kale nodded slowly, feeling a renewed sense of determination. They couldn't afford to give up, not when 10,000 lives depended on them. Still, the thought lingered in the back of his mind. How many more guardians were waiting for them? And what else had the aliens left behind to defend their legacy? As dawn broke over the crimson dunes, casting long shadows across the scared landscape, Kale and Lyra began preparing for the next step. The ruins held the key to reviving humanity, but unlocking it would require courage, ingenuity, and perhaps a willingness to confront the unknown. For now, they pressed onward, knowing full well that the desert wasn't done testing them yet. The drones circled above, their sleek metallic frames glinting ominously in the harsh sunlight. Each movement they made was precise, calculated, like predators sizing up prey. Kale stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The message echoed in his head, "Prove your worth." What did that mean? Was this some kind of test, or a death sentence? "We don't have time to think," Lyra whispered urgently beside him, clutching the energy device tightly. "They're not going to wait." Kale nodded sharply, stepping forward with his hands raised. "We're not here to fight you," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension gripping his chest. "We're survivors. We didn't choose this planet. It chose us." The lead drone tilted slightly, its glowing red sensor focusing on Kale. Then, without warning, it fired a thin beam of light at the ground near his feet. The sand sizzled and melted into glass, sending up a cloud of acrid smoke. Kale stumbled back instinctively, but he forced himself to stay calm. If these machines wanted them dead, they'd already be gone. "They're testing us," Lyra murmured, her eyes darting between the drones and the ruined colony behind them. "Look, they're scanning everything we do." She was right. The drones weren't attacking indiscriminately. They were observing, analyzing. Every step, every word, mattered. Kale realized then what they needed to do: demonstrate that humanity wasn't just another invasive species stumbling blindly through the galaxy. They had to show intelligence, adaptability, the qualities that once made Earth's civilizations thrive. "EOS," Kale barked over his shoulder. "Can you hack into their systems? Find out who sent them." "I can attempt interface," EOS replied, hovering closer to one of the smaller drones. Its optical sensor blinked rapidly as it extended a thin probe toward the machine. Sparks flew as the two devices connected, and for a brief moment, the drones paused mid-air, their movements faltering. Then suddenly, the lead drone emitted a sharp burst of static, and EOS recoiled, its frame shuddering violently. "Intrusion detected," the drone announced coldly. "Final warning. Comply or be eliminated." Lyra cursed under her breath. That didn't work. Kale clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him, but desperation sparked an idea. He glanced down at the vial containing the last sample of the glowing liquid from the ruins. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it might also be their only chance. "Cover me," he said to Lyra before sprinting toward the nearest drone. Ignoring the shouts of protest from the others, he hurled the vial directly at the machine's central core. The liquid exploded on impact, releasing a surge of blinding blue energy that enveloped the drone completely. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the drone let out a high-pitched whine and collapsed to the ground, its systems fried. The remaining drones hesitated, their sensors recalibrating. Seizing the opportunity, Kale shouted, "Now." The team sprang into action. Some used makeshift weapons to disable the grounded drone further, while others worked together to shield themselves from retaliatory attacks. Lyra activated the energy device, amplifying the residual glow from the liquid to create a temporary barrier against incoming fire. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. When the final drone crashed to the sand, silence fell over the desert. Smoke curled upward from the wreckage, and the survivors gathered around Kale, breathing heavily but alive. What just happened?" one of the scouts asked, staring wide-eyed at the destroyed machines. Kale wiped sweat from his brow, his expression grim. "I think we just met the descendants of whoever lived here before us." Lyra nodded, studying fragments of alien text etched into the drone's hulls. "These aren't random machines. They're guardians, programmed to protect this world. And judging by their design, they belong to the same civilization that built the ruins." "But why attack us?" another scout demanded. "We're no threat to them." "That's not how they see it," Kale replied quietly. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where faint shapes could now be seen descending from orbit, larger ships, far more advanced than anything they'd encountered so far. They don't care about our intentions. To them, we're invaders. And unless we find a way to talk to whoever controls these drones, we'll never convince them otherwise. As the ships grew closer, casting long shadows across the sands, Kale felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. Humanity's survival depended on proving they weren't enemies, but convincing those who viewed them as such would take more than strength or ingenuity. It would take understanding and perhaps sacrifice. With no time to waste, Kale turned to his team. We need to get back to the settlement. Now, whatever happens next, we face it together. The crash site buzzed with newfound energy as the first cryopods began to hiss and crack open, releasing streams of frosty vapor into the desert air. One by one, humans emerged, disoriented, weak, but alive. The sight filled Kale with a mix of relief and pride. They had done it. Against all odds, they had awakened humanity after 50,000 years of slumber. But the victory was bittersweet. As more pods came online, Kale couldn't ignore the cost of their success. The ruins were gone, buried under tons of sand and rubble. Whatever knowledge or technology the alien civilization had left behind was lost forever, or so it seemed. And though the glowing liquid's energy had reactivated the pods, its source was now inaccessible, leaving them vulnerable if anything went wrong again. Lyra stood beside him, her face pale but resolute. She clutched the energy device tightly, her knuckles white. "We've bought ourselves time," she said quietly, watching the survivors gather in small groups. "But we can't rely on this system indefinitely. We need to find another way to sustain everyone." Kale nodded, scanning the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly, unforgiving and barren. Survival wouldn't be easy, not with 10,000 mouths to feed and no clear resources in sight. Yet amidst the chaos, there was hope. People were already working together, scavenging materials from the wreckage, building makeshift shelters, and pooling whatever skills they had. Engineers rigged solar panels from damaged ship components, while doctors tended to those struggling with the transition from stasis. Despite the progress, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Not everyone shared Cal's vision for the future. Some argued that staying near the crash site was too dangerous. Others believed they should focus on exploring the planet further, searching for signs of habitable zones or even remnants of the alien civilization. Voices grew louder, debates turned heated, and factions began to form. One evening, as twin suns dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the settlement, Kale found himself standing at the edge of the encampment. He stared at the distant dunes, wondering what lay beyond them. Would they find salvation, or only more danger? Thinking about running, a voice asked softly behind him. Kale turned to see Lyra approaching, her expression unreadable. "Not running," he replied. "Just planning. We can't stay here forever. This place is temporary at best." Lyra sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know, but deciding where to go and how to keep everyone safe is going to take more than just courage. It'll take sacrifice." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Kale knew exactly what she meant. To move forward, they would have to leave parts of their past behind, including the ruins that had saved them, and that decision wouldn't come without consequences. As night fell, Kale called a meeting with the leaders of the emerging factions. Around a flickering fire, faces illuminated by its warm glow, he laid out his plan. Divide the group into smaller teams, each tasked with different priorities. Some would remain at the crash site to maintain operations, while others would venture into the desert to scout for resources and potential threats. Among these scouts, Kale volunteered himself, and Lyra. "We're stronger together," Kale said firmly, addressing the uneasy murmurs around him. "But we won't survive unless we work as one. Every choice we make will shape our future, not just ours, but humanity's." Though not everyone agreed, Most accepted his proposal. By morning, preparations were underway. Supplies were rationed, weapons crafted from scraps, and maps drawn based on EO's limited scans. As Cale packed his gear, he caught glimpses of doubt in people's eyes. Could they really trust him to lead them through this hostile world? Before departing, Lyra handed him a small vial containing the last sample of the glowing liquid. "In case we need it," she explained, her tone cautious. "But use it wisely. There's no telling what else might come looking for us." Cale pocketed the vial, feeling its weight settle in his palm. He glanced back at the growing settlement, then toward the endless dunes ahead. This journey wouldn't be easy, but giving up wasn't an option. Humanity had survived 50,000 years in stasis. Now, it was time to prove they could thrive. With determination burning in his chest, Cale led the first team into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them.